Keqing is a fake cat girl. That's right, her cat ears aren't actually cat ears at all. They're hair. And yeah, I'm sad about it too. You know what else is fake?
My will to live.
Anyways, if you're here, I'm sorry to hear about your 50-50. That really sucks, but it's okay because Keqing got a skin that makes you do 200% more damage. Well, that's if you follow this guide, that is. So today I'm going to be walking you through every single thing you need to know about Keqing, including our kit, best builds, and best teams. Let's get started. Actually, before we get started, I just wanted to let you guys know that I stream a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, and if you like live content, you should come check it out. Okay, now let's get started. I'm gonna be more professional from here on out. The first thing to know about Keqing is that she's generally played as a charged attack main DPS, and what I mean by that is her normal attacks are much weaker and deal way lower damage per second than her charged attacks, so to get the most damage out of her, try to use charged attacks more than normals. Unfortunately, Keqing does have the highest stamina cost for charged attacks of any of the sword users, so your stamina will deplete very quickly, and for that reason it can be difficult to spam charged attacks as much as you'd like, but overall it's really good damage. Keqing's elemental skill throws out a marker that deals low electro damage on contact with an enemy. Once the marker is out, you can either blow up your marker by using her charged attack once, or you can teleport to the marker and deal an AoE slash of electro damage. When you get her first ascension passive unlocked, you'll get the ability to use her electro infusion. Basically, after casting her elemental skill, if you teleport to it, Keqing gets an electro infusion on her weapon for 5 seconds. If you don't choose to teleport to it though, and you cancel it with a charged attack instead, you don't get the electro infusion, but the marker still blows up for a bit of electro damage anyways. And because of that flexibility, you can actually run Keqing as an electro or physical carry. Unfortunately, I won't get into cryo or pyro Keqing in this video, but I do have plans for them actually, so if you're interested or if you just like my content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Lastly, the cooldown is 7.5 seconds, so you can use it fairly often. Keqing's elemental burst hits 10 hits of damage. There's an initial hit, 8 less powerful hits, followed by a big hit at the end. It has a super low 40 energy cost and a 12-second cooldown, and it's worth noting that in a physical Keqing build, her burst damage output is pretty low, but with an electro Keqing build, her burst can contribute a lot to group scenarios. Her Ascension 2 passive makes her burst even better though, because it increases her crit rate and energy recharge by 15% for 8 seconds after casting. Her burst takes a couple of seconds to complete though, so the 8 seconds will feel probably closer to 6 seconds or so after using it, but overall that Ascension passive is great. Keqing's infusion isn't a multiplier like Yoimiya or Hu Tao though, it's actually just an infusion, there's no extra numbers behind it, so you want to level up your normal attacks first, since that's where most of your damage is going to come from if you're not using her in a quick swap team. However, if you do use her in a quick swap team, which we'll talk about later in the video, most of her damage will come from her burst, and so for that reason, I would level her normals, followed by her burst, and then her elemental skill overall, just generally speaking. If you're trying to pre-farm for her, you need Books of Prosperity, Whopper Flower Nectar, and Rings of Boreas from the Wolf Weekly. So now let's talk about weapons for Keqing. There are way too many swords in this game for me to go over every single one, but I will talk about the best options and some good free-to-play options. And for reference, you guys, I used a bunch of different weapon spreadsheets, but the best one to reference is going to be from Keqing mains for obvious reasons. So if you've been playing Keqing, then you probably know that Mist Splitter is technically your best in slot. The one thing to note about this is that you do have to make sure you're getting all of the stacks on Mist Splitter for it to actually beat out Jade Cutter. And generally speaking, if you know how to play Keqing to a high level, it's not very hard for you to get all the stacks, but for more casual players, you may not pay as much attention to it, and so your damage ceiling is lowered by a lot. Mist Splitter is definitely best in slot for Electro Keqing overall if you're talking about just damage ceiling, but for physical, since this passive isn't going to really be giving you any damage bonus, outside of your burst and skill that is, it becomes just a stat stick. Right below Mist Splitter, and I mean right below Mist Splitter, is Jade Cutter, which has no caveats. It can be used in Electro, physical, or any other elemental Keqing build. It's really solid, and it just works unconditionally. Jade Cutter is just generally one of the most flexible weapons in the game, and so if you ever see it on a banner that's not that Trap Kokomi banner from last time, you should definitely look into it. If you're looking at other weapons though, Summit Shaper is actually a really good option for Keqing as well, since her elemental burst can activate all of Summit Shaper's stacks. Summit Shaper's passive allows your Keqing to get a lot higher of an attack stat, but the one downside would be that if you're going to run this weapon, you need to play Keqing with a shield, and you need to have good crit substats, because crit builds are always going to be stronger than full attack builds for Keqing. The same thing with crits applies to Lion's Roar as well, since its passive is super strong for Electro Keqing, and it's one of her best weapons at Refinement 5. This weapon works best in Electro Charge teams because its passive only works with Electro or Pyro applied, and if you apply Pyro, then you may end up just knocking enemies away from you with Overload. So in general, and from my testing, I found that Lion's Roar worked best with Electro Charged. There's a few more options that are good, like Black Sword from the Battle Pass for its crit rate and its passive, Akila Favonia, which ends up being tied with Jade Cutter for physical Keqing, but it's about on par with the Black Sword in an Electro build. The free-to-play Inazuma Sword, whose name I can't pronounce, and Harbinger of Dawn at Refinement 5 are also great options. Now, the one thing I want to say about Harbinger of Dawn is it's an amazing weapon because of how much crit it gives you with its passive, but in current content, I actually don't recommend it. Right now, the Spiral Abyss and even some overworld content has Rift Wolves as the featured premier enemy that they just want to shove down our throats, and Harbinger's passive is only on when you're above 90% health. Because of corrosion, it can be really hard to keep that health up, so I actually wouldn't recommend using Harbinger of Dawn right now, but in the future, if we see that mechanic go away and you happen to roll Keqing then Harbinger of Dawn will be pretty good. Lastly, Prototype Rancor is an amazing weapon for free-to-play players if you're building physical Keqing because its base attack is really high and it gives physical damage bonus as its main stat. There are tons of other weapons in the game like Black Cliff, the Flute, Skyward Blade, Freedom Sworn, and Alley Flash, but generally speaking, the weapons I listed above are going to be better options. Again, the main thing to think about for weapons is crit though, because if your AR 45 or higher and your crit is like 30 crit rate and 100 crit damage, building the Black Sword would get you overall better damage over time than Lion's Roar, because it would make you crit more consistently, which means higher damage over time. But if you can pull off at least 50 crit rate to 100 crit damage with an attack percent weapon, then that's going to be a pretty solid choice as well. Now, during that weapons segment, I mentioned Electro Keqing and Physical Keqing a couple times, and the main difference is going to be that with a Physical Keqing build, you're focusing around Superconduct and not infusing her weapon with Electro. In an Electro build, though, you do want to focus on using her elemental skill to infuse Electro because, I mean, that just makes sense, right? But anyways, I want to compare the two. So Electro Keqing has like 4 main things that are going for it. So the first thing is that it has really good AoE damage because her burst is a pretty big AoE and her elemental skill can also be decent AoE damage as well, and those are both Electro damage. Another thing that Electro Keqing has going for her is elemental reaction damage, because with the Electro infusion, you'll be able to proc a lot more elemental reactions, which can add up to a lot of damage. In addition to that, unlike a physical build, Electro damage does not fall off as hard in endgame, the main reason being that there just aren't a lot of enemies that resist Electro, whereas there are tons of enemies that resist physical. The last thing would be that her constellations benefit her Electro damage side, but they don't really benefit her physical damage side, and for those reasons, I think that Electro Keqing is really solid. Physical Keqing is also pretty solid as well though, because she has access to freeze teams and cryo units when you're using Superconduct, and when you're not using an Electro infusion, you're not going to break frozen units. You also get a free Prototype Rancor at AR 10, which means that you're going to have access to a good free-to-play physical weapon without having to get lucky at a world boss. In general, I do think it's a little bit easier to build Physical Keqing, especially in early game for that reason, but unfortunately, as I mentioned before, physical damage does fall off in really late game, especially if your character doesn't have built-in physical resistance reduction like some of the later characters like Shinha, C6 Rosaria, and Eula. I'm not going to argue that one is better than another. I will say that I always prefer to run Electro Keqing, but in general, both of those builds can work. So how do you build both of these? Well, I'm going to tell you in a second after this transition. For an Electro Keqing build, you actually have a few options. The best one is going to be 2-piece Thundering Fury and 2-piece Gladiator or Shimenawa because it's unconditional and it just gives you good stat bonuses. 18% attack is nice and 15% electro damage is nice, and overall it's just really comfy. Now technically the 4-piece Thunder Soother set is higher damage output overall, but it does have some caveats to it, like being forced to run Electro Charge. If you're playing Thunder Soother without an Electro Charge team, there can be plenty of enemies who don't get that Electro application that you're looking for to boost your damage, and there are some enemies like Slimes that just will never get Electro on them if they're not Hydro. So overall, Thunder Soother can be really solid, but it really just depends on the content you're doing. Another solid option is to run 2-piece Gladiator and 2 Shimenawa, because that'll give you just a fat 36% attack bonus, and it can be super easy to farm because eventually you're probably going to have 2 good Gladiator pieces, and Shimenawa is just going to come with all of the farming you're doing for Emblem of Severed Fate since so many characters use that, so these 2 pieces can actually be really solid. Between all of those sets though, I would just choose the ones that let you crit the best, or just have the best general substats. For reference, your substat priority is just going to be crit rate and crit damage until you get at least a 50 to 100 ratio, which isn't actually that hard to do with Keqing because of her Ascension. But yeah, just focus on crit as much as you can for her artifacts, and then attack percent is also very good. Keqing doesn't actually really need that much energy recharge as is because her burst cost is already so low. For main stats, you're going to want an attack percent Sands, an electro damage goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet, and overall those should get you the best damage on Electro Keqing. If you want to build physical Keqing though, you have a few options, but her best in slot option is gonna be 4-piece Pale Flame. People generally don't actually like to use the full Pale Flame set because the 4-piece effect requires you to deal damage to enemies twice to activate the bonus, but with Keqing it's actually really easy. Her first skill cast counts as one hit, and when you charged attack to blow it up rather than infuse, those hits also count as elemental skill damage, which will activate the Pale Flame 4-piece super quickly. When it's active, it'll give you a total of 50% physical damage bonus and 18% attack, so it's just really good if you know how to use it. But of course, 4-piece sets can be really hard to farm, so if you have trouble finding the last 2 pieces for your Pale Flame set, you can also farm 2 pieces of Bloodstained Chivalry to go 2 and 2 with Pale Flame. The Bloodstained domain is actually really resin efficient if you're farming for physical characters because it drops Noblesse pieces, which are highly used for supports and for characters that just deal a lot of burst damage. In total, with 2 Bloodstained and 2 Pale Flame, you'll see 50% physical damage bonus, but you won't see the 18% attack from Pale Flame. If you have any Gladiators or Shimenawa pieces with decent substats though, you can use a 2-piece from that set as well for 18% more attack, or you could just go with 2 Gladiator, 2 Shimenawa, just like the Electro build. Now, one last set option you have for physical Keqing is actually pretty neat. It's the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set. It's honestly highly specialized and not super common, but if you know how to use it, it can be very good. The benefit of it is 40% crit rate against frozen enemies, which physical Keqing can take really good advantage of. After using the first Superconduct, you won't need to do it again for a few seconds, and enemies can be frozen. Overall, I'd stick to one of the first 3 sets mentioned though, unless you have a strong dedicated freeze team. In general, 4-piece Pale Flame is going to be the best, but between all of these sets, whatever one is going to make it so that you can crit consistently is probably going to be the best set for you. For main stats, you're going to want an attack percent Sands, a physical damage goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet, whatever will get you a better 1-to-2 ratio of crit rate to crit damage. You might be wondering why I didn't mention Shimenawa's Reminiscence. A lot of people have questions about this set because on paper it looks like the best set. 50% normal charged and plunging attack damage is actually a substantial increase, and you get the 18% attack from the 2-piece. It's understandable why people would think it's the best set. When I say it's not the best set, I'm more referring to its overall damage ceiling, the highest possible damage that you could get with that set versus other sets. In theory, if you play a perfect Keqing with a perfect rotation with perfect amounts of energy recharge, the damage ceiling of Shimenawa's Reminiscence is the highest. But if you're missing one of those perfect stats, you're either going to have to skip an elemental burst or you're going to have to miss a window where you can get the Shimenawa buff. If you so much as miss one window for Shimenawa buff, or if you miss one window for her elemental burst to be used, then you end up actually losing damage in comparison to Thundering Fury Gladiator. And if you know how to hold left click to cancel your elemental skill with Pale Flame, then Pale Flame already ends up doing more damage anyways. So for those reasons, I don't recommend Shimenawa's Reminiscence. Now you could always try energy funneling, but overall it can just end up being a really big hassle. Now if you don't actually care about perfect rotations or anything like that, then Shimenawa will actually be fine for you. But for most people, if you're trying to get the most damage you can, Shimenawa is not going to be it. Something I was really surprised by when I was kind of researching Keqing and testing her out was that she has a lot of viable teams. Now, Keqing isn't actually in any top meta teams herself, she's not like a top unit or anything, but the fact that she can work in so many different comps with so many different supports is really, really cool. So the first team that I want to talk about is Electro Charge Keqing. This team is going to feature Keqing, Fischl, Xingqiu, and a Flex Spot. The idea here is that Electro Charge is going to periodically stun enemies, which is going to make you take less overall damage, and also Electro Charge is kind of satisfying to play. But yeah, you can replace Xingqiu with Kokomi if you want, or you can replace him with Mona. Either one of these characters is going to be fine because they're going to take Hydro damage, which will help you proc Electro Charged, and they're all basically used for different things. The Flex Spot can be Kazuha or Sucrose for grouping utility in Viridescent Venerer, which will buff your Keqing or whatever other characters you're using like Xingqiu, and Sucrose can also use Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers if you're not using Kokomi with Thrilling Tales already. And on top of that, you can actually slot Beidou into the Flex Spot. Now, a lot of people talk about how strong Beidou is and how Beidou is one of the most broken units in Genshin, but she doesn't actually fit into a lot of teams the way we want her to because she requires a battery to be effective, and that's basically 2 slots taken up by Electro characters immediately. But in this team where it's focused on Electro, Beidou is incredibly strong. Overall, this team can be a super solid choice and isn't too expensive to build. The next team I want to talk about is Quick Swap Electro, and this one's going to feature Keqing, Sarah, an Anemo character, and Bennett. First things first, Bennett will not work in Keqing teams if he's C6 because his infusion will overwrite Keqing's Electro. The exception exception is with a Pyro Keqing build, but that's for another video. Quick Swap is basically what it sounds like. Characters aren't going to be on the field for very long with the exception of Keqing, who can be out on the field to deal extra damage while cooldowns are rolling, but generally speaking she won't be. Now there are honestly a million versions of Quick Swap with Keqing. This is just one that I like the most. You can use someone like Kazuha or Sucrose to group enemies and shred resistances, Bennett to buff your Sara burst and Keqing damage, and Sara to also buff Keqing's damage significantly while dealing out a lot of damage herself. You'll be swapping through characters fairly often, but I personally think it's a fun way to play. Maybe it's just an ADHD thing, I don't really know. You can also put in Jean, Fischl, or Mona for Sara or Bennett. All of those characters have manageable cooldowns that can dish out really good damage. The third and final team that I want to talk to you guys about today is going to be a physical or freeze Keqing build, and I'll explain that in a minute. This team is going to feature Keqing, any cryo damage dealer, any cryo healer, and a flex. Keqing herself can apply Electro needed to superconduct with her burst or elemental skill. Just make sure not to activate her infusion when you're playing a physical build. Since you won't be spamming superconduct as often as possible, enemies will have cryo applied to them pretty frequently, which makes cryo resonance actually useful and encourages you to run double cryo. This will get you 15% more crit rate when you're hitting enemies affected by cryo, and it's really good. There's also two great cryo healers in the game in the form of Diona and Chi-Chi, and either of them will work in a physical Keqing team. If you run Chi-Chi, you can use her with the clam set to output extra physical damage, but if you use Diona, you get a shield utility for comfort of play. Now from my tests, I prefer to run Diona since shield is just comfy, but it does get you lower damage over running clam Chi-Chi. For the cryo DPS, you can use Rosaria, Kaya, or support Ganyu. And I actually really like Kaya here because Keqing takes up a ton of stamina with her charged attacks, but Kaya's passive reduces the stamina cost of sprinting by a little bit, so you can save some stamina while you're dodging. You can run Senna in this comp, but I don't really recommend it since her personal damage isn't super high in comparison to other options, but if you do run her, you'll want to put her in the flex spot. As for other flex characters, I recommend Kazuha, Sucrose, or Zhongli. The last thing about physical Keqing is that you can use her in a freeze team, which could replace the flex spot with Xingqiu. You'll superconduct enough to get a physical damage bonus, but outside of that, enemies should stay frozen, and you'll be able to get in free damage without knocking enemies away with charge attacks, which is super comfy. Let me tell you, when the enemies aren't flying away, it is so much easier to play the game. Now you may be wondering about Yunjin, and unfortunately Yunjin actually isn't that great with Keqing because Keqing's charged attack multipliers are just so good that it's not really worth using her normal attacks at all unless you're out of stamina. Because Yunjin only buffs normal attacks, it doesn't really make it worth using her with Keqing unless you just really like both characters, I don't know. Now, honestly, there's not really a point in talking about how much these constellations are worth because you don't choose Keqing, she chooses you. But I want to explain some of these because there's some bugs and misunderstood parts of our constellations. Constellation 1 makes it so that when you recast your skill to teleport, there's a small explosion where Keqing starts and finishes the animation that does damage based on 50% of her attack stat at the time. Now, this does work with Bennett, but overall, it's not really that big of an improvement in damage. Her Constellation 2 would be amazing and potentially enable Shimenawa, but it's bugged. What it should do is generate an energy particle once every 5 seconds or so when Keqing is using her normal and charged attacks against enemies with Electro, but what it really does is it generates a particle as intended, but the cooldown resets without actually being off cooldown in the first place. Imagine you have a 5-second timer, and every 5 seconds you get $1 million, but every time your heart beats, the clock resets. It's effectively just never generating a particle again because the cooldown keeps refreshing. I really hope miHoYo looks into this and fixes it, but it's apparently been around since the beginning of the game, so it's pretty unlikely. Constellation 3 increases her burst level by 3. Her Constellation 4 gives Keqing a 24% attack bonus after creating an Electro reaction. 25% attack is a pretty big increase and definitely makes this one of Keqing's better constellations. Her Constellation 5 increases her skill level by 3, and her Constellation 6 increases her Electro damage by 6% for 8 seconds every time you use a normal attack, charged attack, elemental skill, or burst. It's honestly worded pretty poorly. You get 1 stack of 6% Electro damage for each one of these forms of attack, so you can get up to 24% Electro damage bonus during one rotation, which is a substantial damage increase. All of the stacks are counted down independently though, so they can fall off if you don't recast those attacks within the 8-second window. Now, in general, Keqing's constellations aren't really anything to write home about, but they're an upgrade like you'd expect. So usually in this section I would review a character, but do I need to review this character? You got them on accident anyways. Honestly, Keqing is fine. Not a game-breaking character, but not really a top DPS either. I do think she has one thing on the other 5-star characters though, and that's that she's incredibly fun. Her elemental skill is mobile and can disable ruin guards. Her infusion isn't a separate multiplier, so you can play her as Pyro or Cryo and not miss out on too much damage. And she has a lot of flexibility in teams because there's so many characters in the game that can help her damage output. If you like Electro Electro, fun combat, or cat girls, Keqing is for you. Anyways, with all that being said, you guys, thank you so much for watching my Keqing guide. Let me know if you're using her down below in the comments, and tell me what you think about this skin actually. I really like it personally, but I want to know your guys' thoughts. Make sure to sub if you've enjoyed the video. Make sure to like the video if you want the video to go anywhere in the algorithm. I'd really appreciate it. Come hang out in the Discord community or Twitch community, link in the description, and I will catch you guys later.